In the annals of American Gothic horror, some tales are not born of phantoms or ghouls, but from the far more tangible specter of human cruelty. The story of Jeremiah Cobb is one such account, a name whispered in the humid air of 1852 Vicksburg. It is the chronicle of a man forged in the crucible of bondage, who, with a single, brutal act, carved his name into the dark folklore of the Mississippi Delta. His was not a haunting of rattling chains, but of a silence that followed a sickening crack of bone, a silence that testified to the moment an enslaved man left his master dead in the dirt, and in doing so, became a legend known only as the Neck Snapper. If you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, where truth is often more unsettling than fiction, and this is your first time in our archive, then consider subscribing. Join us, and ensure that the echoes of these forgotten lives are never truly lost to silence. The city of Vicksburg, in the year of our Lord 1852, was a monument to commerce built upon human souls. It clung to the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, a muddy, churning artery that carried the lifeblood of the South, cotton, downstream to the hungry ports of the world. The air itself was heavy, thick with a humidity that rose from the water in a perpetual miasma, mingling with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms and the acrid smoke of the paddle wheel steamers that constantly churned at the docks. From the high ground, where the planters and merchants built their grand houses with their sweeping verandas and tall white columns, one could watch the river traffic as a god might watch the movements of lesser beings. But down below, at the waterfront, the reality was one of mud, sweat, and ceaseless labor. The streets were often little more than rutted tracts of earth, turned to a thick, clinging gumbo by the frequent rains. The noise was a constant clamor, the rhythmic chanting of enslaved stevedores, hoisting enormous bales of cotton, the sharp crack of a foreman's whip, the clang of hammers from a blacksmith's shop, and the lowing of livestock being driven to market. This was a city of stark, unyielding contrasts. Fine carriages drawn by immaculate horses would splash mud onto the bare feet of enslaved men and women sent to market, their eyes downcast, their presence as unremarkable to the carriage's occupants as the very cobblestones beneath their wheels. The prosperity of Vicksburg was a veneer, a layer of gold leaf over a core of profound human misery. The city's wealth was not merely supported by slavery, it was slavery. The entire economic and social structure depended upon the institution, as a body depends upon its bones. The slave pens, located discreetly but never truly hidden, were a constant, grim reminder of this foundation. There, human beings were appraised like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded, their histories erased and replaced with a bill of sale. Families were fractured without a thought, a husband sold south, a wife and children sold west, their cries swallowed by the indifferent hum of commerce. The fear that permeated the enslaved community was a palpable thing, a sixth sense that governed every interaction, every glance, every word spoken or left unsaid. It was the fear of the auction block, the fear of the lash, and the deeper, more insidious fear of having one's very humanity stripped away until nothing remained but a tool for another's profit. The legal framework of Mississippi in 1852 offered no recourse, no protection. The law was an instrument of the enslaver, designed not for justice but for control, ensuring that the system, in all its brutal efficiency, could perpetuate itself without challenge. It was a world built on a fragile and volatile peace, a peace maintained through the constant, unblinking application of terror. Beyond the city limits, this world became even more concentrated, more isolated. The plantations spread out across the landscape, vast tracts of land carved from the wilderness, their fields stretching to the horizon, under a sky that seemed to press down with a physical weight. Here, the life of an enslaved man was a relentless cycle of toil, governed by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. The day began before dawn, with a summons that was not a gentle awakening but a harsh command. The air in the cramped, windowless cabins was stale with the breath of too many bodies, the floors often nothing more than packed earth. There was no privacy, no space for quiet contemplation, only the communal existence of a people held in bondage. The work in the cotton fields was a unique form of torment. The plants themselves, with their sharp-edged bowls, tore at the flesh, leaving hands and arms perpetually raw and scarred. The labor was backbreaking, a constant stooping and pulling under a sun that beat down with a fury that could fell a man as surely as a blow. Overseers on horseback patrolled the rows, their presence a constant, silent threat. Their authority was absolute, their word law. They carried long, braided leather whips, and they used them not only for punishment but as a tool of daily enforcement, a casual reminder of who held the power of life, pain, and death. The brutality was not always explosive. Often, it was a slow, grinding degradation. It was in the meager rations, barely enough to sustain a body for another day of hard labor. It was in the threadbare clothing that offered little protection from the elements. It was in the denial of a name, the forced adoption of a master's surname as another mark of ownership. It was in the prohibition of literacy, a deliberate act to keep minds in darkness, to sever any connection to a world of ideas beyond the confines of the plantation. This system was designed to break the human spirit, to crush any flicker of defiance before it could ignite into a flame. It sought to create a state of learned helplessness, a complete dependence on the very individuals who were the architects of their suffering. Yet, the human spirit, even under such immense pressure, is not so easily extinguished. It finds ways to survive, to endure. It manifests in the quiet humming of a forbidden song in the fields, a melody carried over from a forgotten homeland. It lives in the secret stories told in the dead of night, tales of tricksters and heroes that carry a subtext of resistance. It survives in a shared glance between two men in the field, a silent acknowledgement of a shared burden. These were the small, almost invisible acts of rebellion that kept the soul alive in a world determined to kill it. It was from this crucible of institutionalized violence and quiet endurance that a man named Jeremiah emerged. He was not born with a spirit of rebellion any more than any other man, but the world he inhabited had a way of forging such spirits in the fires of its own cruelty. On the plantation where he was enslaved, a sprawling enterprise some miles from the bustling docks of Vicksburg, Jeremiah was known for his physical strength and his profound silence. He was a large man, with arms and shoulders thick with muscle earned from years of clearing timber and plowing fields. His hands were calloused and scarred, maps of a life of unrelenting physical toil. But it was his silence that most defined him. While other men might curse their fate under their breath or find solace in communal complaint, Jeremiah worked with a focused, unnerving stillness. His eyes, deep-set and watchful, seemed to miss nothing. He observed the casual cruelty of the overseer, the weary resignation in the faces of his fellow captives, the way the master carried himself with an air of unassailable authority. He absorbed it all, and his silence grew deeper, heavier, like the gathering of a storm cloud. There was one small, humanizing detail that set Jeremiah apart in the minds of the few who paid him any real attention. He had an uncanny ability to read the sky. He could look at the color of the clouds at sunset, feel the subtle shift in the wind's direction, and predict the coming of a storm with an accuracy that often surpassed any almanac. It was a simple skill, one learned from a lifetime spent outdoors, but in a world that sought to reduce him to a mere beast of burden, It was his own. It was a piece of knowledge that belonged to him and him alone, a small flicker of autonomy in an existence defined by its complete absence. This connection to the natural world seemed to give him a kind of anchor, a way to understand the forces around him, even as he was powerless against the human forces that governed his life. He watched the cycles of the seasons, the patterns of the rain, the inexorable movement of the sun across the sky, and perhaps he saw in them a truth that his captors could not comprehend, that all things, even the most oppressive seasons of suffering, must eventually come to an end. This intimate understanding of the environment, of the very soil he was forced to till, grounded him in a reality that was older and more powerful than the transient institution of slavery. The atmosphere on this particular plantation was especially toxic. The master, a man whose name has been lost to the deliberate indifference of history, was known for a temperament that was as volatile and unpredictable as a summer squall on the Mississippi. He was a man who wielded his power not just with the casual entitlement of his class, but with a sadistic relish. His cruelty was not merely a tool for enforcing discipline, it seemed to be a source of genuine pleasure. He would devise new and ever more humiliating punishments for the slightest infraction, his voice a low, menacing drawl as he described the pain he was about to inflict. The air in the great house, with its polished floors and fine furniture, was thick with a tension that was different from the weary oppression of the fields. It was a sharp, acidic fear, the kind that keeps one perpetually on edge, waiting for the next eruption of rage. The enslaved people who worked in the house learned to move like ghosts, to make themselves as invisible as possible, to read the master's moods in the set of his jaw or the cadence of his footsteps on the stairs. They knew that his anger could be triggered by anything, a misplaced object, a meal that was not to his liking, or simply a dark turn of his own private thoughts. Jeremiah, for the most part, worked in the fields, and so he was somewhat removed from the daily psychological warfare of the main house. But no one was truly safe from the master's reach. His presence could be felt everywhere, a shadow that stretched over every acre of the land he owned. Jeremiah had seen the results of his fury, men whipped until their backs were a crosshatch of raw, bleeding flesh, women subjected to unspeakable humiliations, families torn apart on a whim. Each act of violence was a message, a demonstration of power intended to terrorize not just the victim, but all who witnessed it. And Jeremiah was a witness. His silent, watchful nature meant that he saw it all. He stored these images away, filed them in the quiet archives of his mind. The sight of a friend being punished for a moment's rest, the sound of a woman's weeping in the night, the arrogant, satisfied look on the master's face after he had asserted his dominance. These were the things that filled his silence. They were the fuel that was slowly, imperceptibly, bringing a deep internal pressure to a critical point. The world of 1852 Vicksburg, with its veneer of civilized society and its rotten core of brutality, had created the conditions for an explosion. It had taken a man, stripped him of his freedom, and subjected him to a relentless campaign of physical and psychological abuse. It was a system that assumed the human capacity for endurance was infinite. In the case of Jeremiah Cobb, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The storm he had been watching gather for so long was not in the sky above, but within himself, and the world he knew was about to be irrevocably altered by its breaking. The transition from the sprawling, impersonal cruelty of the slaveholding South to the intensely personal conflict brewing on a single plantation was nearly complete. The stage was being set for a confrontation, an inevitable collision between the absolute power of an enslaver and the breaking point of an enslaved man. Jeremiah's existence was tethered to the rhythm of the sun and the will of another man. His days were a testament to the brutal mathematics of plantation life, where the value of a man was measured in the acreage he could plow or the number of cotton bales he could haul. His specific duties were varied, a reflection of his physical capacity, which the master exploited with a relentless and unimaginative efficiency. In the planting season, he was a fixture behind the plow, his broad back bent for hours, his hands gripping the sweat-slicked handles as he guided the blade through the dense, unforgiving Mississippi soil. The work was a slow, grinding battle against the earth itself, each furrow a line item in a ledger of human exhaustion. He learned the language of the mules, the subtle shifts in their posture that signaled fatigue or stubbornness, and he spoke it not with his voice, but with a steady, patient pressure on the reins. He came to know the land with an intimacy his enslaver could never possess. He knew which fields held the richest soil, which were prone to flooding after a heavy rain, and where the clay was so thick it would cling to the plowshare like a shroud. This knowledge, however, was not his own. It was merely another asset belonging to the plantation, a piece of living machinery that understood its terrain. When the crops were laid by, his labor did not cease. He was tasked with the endless maintenance that such an enterprise required. He mended fences, his hands working with a practiced economy as he stretched new wire and hammered posts deep into the ground. He cleared new ground, the rhythmic swing of his axe, a sound that echoed through the humid woods from dawn until dusk. This was perhaps the most grueling work of all. He would stand before ancient oaks and formidable hickories, trees that had stood for a century or more, and he would bring them down with nothing but his own strength and a piece of sharpened steel. The impact of the axe shuddered up his arms and into his shoulders, a jarring percussion that became the soundtrack of his life. He would then have to deal with the stumps, a Sisyphean task of digging, chopping, and burning that left his body aching with a deep, resonant pain. He built and repaired the outbuildings, the smokehouse, the barns, the very cabins that housed the enslaved, his own hands constructing the architecture of his captivity. His labor was woven into the very fabric of the place, yet he held no claim to any of it. He was a creator without ownership, a builder without a home. The relationship between Jeremiah and his enslaver was not a relationship in any human sense of the word. It was a dynamic of absolute ownership and reluctant submission, a constant low-grade war fought in the currency of glances, gestures, and the ever-present threat of violence. The master was a man who seemed to derive a sense of his own importance from the fear he could inspire in others. He was not a distant, patrician figure, content to let his overseers manage his affairs. He was intimately involved in the daily operations of the plantation, his presence a source of constant, corrosive anxiety. He would often appear without warning, a silent figure on horseback at the edge of a field, his eyes scanning the workers with a cold, appraising gaze. He was searching for any sign of weakness, any lapse in pace, any excuse to exercise his authority. His corrections were never gentle, his instructions never kind. He spoke to the enslaved not as men, but as recalcitrant tools that needed to be reminded of their function. He would demand to know why a task was not proceeding faster, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that promised consequences. He would critique their work with a sneering contempt, finding fault where none existed, seemingly for the sheer sport of it. The master's temperament was a thing of terrifying unpredictability. There were days when he would remain in the great house, a brooding, unseen presence, and a fragile, temporary peace might settle over the fields. But these periods were always short-lived. His anger, when it came, was like a flash flood, a sudden, overwhelming force that swept away everything in its path. It could be triggered by the most trivial of matters, a piece of equipment left out in the rain, a mule that had thrown a shoe, a perceived look of insolence in a man's eyes. The abuse was not merely a matter of whippings. though those were frequent and savage. It was a more insidious, more psychological form of torture. He understood that control was best maintained not through constant punishment, but through the constant fear of it. He would single out one individual for a day of relentless harassment, following him from task to task, his commentary a steady drip of insults and threats. He would pit people against each other, offering small, meaningless privileges for information, fostering an atmosphere of distrust that prevented any real solidarity from taking root. He would talk about selling a man's wife or children away to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a fate that was understood to be a death sentence, and he would watch with a detached curiosity as the man's spirit visibly withered under the weight of the threat. For a long time, Jeremiah endured this reality with the same stoic silence he applied to his labor. He had learned, as all enslaved people had to, the art of internal retreat. He had built walls within his own mind, a place where the master's voice could not fully penetrate, a place where his own thoughts remained his own. He worked, he ate, he slept, and he kept his eyes on the ground. He made himself small, inconspicuous, a difficult task for a man of his size. He did his work without complaint, followed every order to the letter, and took care to never, ever meet the master's gaze. This was the strategy for survival, the path of least resistance. To show any sign of defiance, to betray any flicker of resentment, was to invite a level of punishment that could break a man's body and scar his soul. Jeremiah had seen it happen to others. He had seen men, proud and strong, who had dared to speak back, who had allowed a moment of frustration to show on their faces. He had seen them tied to a post and whipped until their cries for mercy faded into unconsciousness. He had seen them return to the fields, their bodies broken, their eyes hollowed out, the fight gone from them forever. And so Jeremiah held his silence. It was his shield, his armor, his only defense in a world where he was otherwise defenseless. But a shield can only withstand so many blows before it begins to fracture. The master, perhaps sensing the deep, unplumbed well of strength in Jeremiah, began to single him out. It was a subtle shift at first, an extra task added at the end of an already grueling day, a smaller ration of food, with the casual explanation that a man of his size needed to be kept lean. A constant stream of verbal provocations, questions designed to trick him into an impertinent response. The master seemed to be testing him, probing for a weakness, for a crack in his silent facade. It was a cruel and dangerous game, and Jeremiah knew the stakes. He absorbed the provocations, swallowed the insults, and continued his work. But inside, something was beginning to change. The walls he had built within his mind were beginning to crumble. The master's voice, which he had for so long been able to keep at a distance, was now a constant, echoing presence in his thoughts. The silence that had once been a refuge was now becoming a prison, a space where his own suppressed rage was growing, expanding, demanding to be heard. The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket, and the sun was a white-hot eye in a cloudless sky. A young boy, no more than 12 years of age, had collapsed in the field from heat and exhaustion. The overseer had dismounted and was standing over the boy, prodding him with the toe of his boot, ordering him to get up. The master, who had been watching from the shade of a large oak tree, rode over slowly. He looked down at the boy with an expression of pure disgust. He told the overseer that he was being too soft, that such weakness needed to be dealt with decisively. He dismounted and grabbed the boy by his thin arm, hauling him to his feet. The boy was barely conscious, his legs unable to support him. The master began to berate him, his voice laced with a venomous contempt. He told the boy he was worthless, a drain on his resources, and that he would make an example of him. He uncoiled the whip from his belt. Jeremiah, who was working in the next row, stopped. For the first time in years, he looked up. He looked directly at the master. He did not say a word. He did not move a muscle. He simply stood there, his axe held loosely in one hand, and he watched. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and for a moment, the two men were locked in a silent confrontation across the rows of cotton. The master saw the look in Jeremiah's eyes. He saw the defiance, the challenge, the raw, undiluted hatred that Jeremiah had kept hidden for so long. The master faltered. His hand, which had been raised to strike the boy, hesitated. In that moment, the carefully constructed hierarchy of the plantation was suspended. There was no master, no slave, only two men locked in a battle of wills. The master, unaccustomed to being challenged in any form, was the first to look away. He let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound that held no humor. He released the boy, who crumpled to the ground. He turned to Jeremiah and told him that he had a special task for him after the day's work was done. The threat was clear. An example would be made, not of the boy, but of the man who had dared to challenge him with a look. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, Jeremiah's endurance finally collapsed. The day's events had been the final, unbearable weight placed upon a spirit that was already strained to its breaking point. As he walked from the fields toward the main house, where he knew the master was waiting for him, he felt a strange and terrifying calm descend upon him. The fear that had been his constant companion for his entire life was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He was no longer thinking about survival. He was no longer calculating the odds or weighing the consequences. The complex machinery of self-preservation that had governed his every action had simply shut down. He looked at his own hands. He saw the calluses, the scars, the dirt ground deep into the lines of his skin. But he saw them differently now. He saw their size, their thickness, their power. He felt the strength that resided in his arms and his shoulders, a strength that had been used his entire life to enrich another man, to build a world that was his prison. The creaking of the plantation house as he approached sounded like the groaning of a dying animal. The light from the lanterns cast a sickly yellow glow, making the familiar shapes of the buildings seem alien and menacing. The air, heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, felt thick and hard to breathe. He was walking into the heart of the shadow that had dominated his life, but for the first time, he was not afraid of the darkness. The psychological breaking point had been reached, and in its place was a resolve as hard and unyielding as stone. The long, brutal process of endurance was over. A new and terrible chapter was about to begin. The walk from the fields was a journey through a landscape that was both intimately familiar and suddenly terrifyingly alien. Every landmark that Jeremiah had known for years seemed to have been subtly altered, imbued with a new and menacing significance. The lone cypress tree at the edge of the woods no longer stood as a simple marker of place, but as a gaunt, skeletal witness, its wispy moss hanging like funeral shrouds in the fading light. The path itself, a ribbon of packed earth his own feet had helped to wear smooth over countless journeys, felt different beneath his soles, as if the ground itself could sense the change that had taken root in him. The air, thick and wet, clung to his skin not with the familiar embrace of a Mississippi evening, but with the suffocating weight of a premonition. The symphony of the night was beginning, the rhythmic chorus of cicadas and tree frogs, but to Jeremiah, it sounded like a frantic, rising alarm. A sound that was counting down the final moments of the world he had always known. He could see the great house ahead, its windows beginning to glow with the warm, buttery light of oil lamps. It stood on a slight rise, a beacon of a life he could only serve, never share. It looked solid, permanent, an unassailable fortress of power, and he was walking directly towards its heart. He did not go to the front veranda, with its grand white columns that rose like the bleached bones of some long-dead beast. His destination was the rear of the house, a domain of workshops, smokehouses, and storage sheds, the functional, unadorned underbelly of the plantation's opulence. He knew the master would be waiting for him there, in a place where business was conducted and discipline was meted out, far from the delicate sensibilities of the main residence. As he rounded the corner of the smokehouse, its walls perpetually stained dark by years of hickory smoke, he saw him. The master was standing on the covered breezeway that connected the kitchen to the main house, a space that was open to the night air on two sides. A single lantern sat on a nearby barrel, casting a pool of unsteady yellow light and throwing his shadow, long and distorted, against the whitewashed wall behind him. He was holding a coiled bullwhip in his right hand, not in a threatening posture, but with a casual proprietary air, as if it were a natural extension of his own arm. He was perfectly still, a predator waiting for his prey to walk into the trap. When Jeremiah stepped into the circle of light, the master allowed a slow, thin smile to spread across his face. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, a simple muscular arrangement that signaled satisfaction and contempt. He did not raise his voice. His tone was conversational, almost gentle, a technique he often employed before an act of extreme violence, believing it heightened the psychological torment. He told Jeremiah that he was a disappointment. He spoke of the investment he had made, the food and shelter he had provided, and he framed Jeremiah's momentary defiance in the field not as an act of will, but as a malfunction of his property. He said that a tool that did not perform its function must be corrected, and that he had been thinking all afternoon about the appropriate form of that correction. He talked about the importance of order, of every man knowing his place. He explained, with the patient cadence of a man teaching a simple child a difficult lesson, that the look Jeremiah had given him was a crack in the foundation of their world, and that it must be sealed with a demonstration of absolute authority. He wanted Jeremiah to understand, he said, that his body, his time, his very life belonged to him, and that this ownership would now be reasserted in a way that no one on the plantation would ever forget. Throughout this monologue, Jeremiah remained silent. He stood just at the edge of the lantern light, his large frame partially cloaked in the surrounding gloom. The cold certainty that had settled over him in the fields had not dissipated. It had solidified, hardening into a resolve that felt as dense and heavy as granite. He listened to the master's words, but they seemed to be coming from a great distance, the meaningless chatter of a world he was no longer a part of. He was intensely aware of his own physical presence. He could feel the solid ground beneath his worn-out boots. He could feel the slight tremor in his own hands, not from fear, but from a vast and terrible energy that was coiling in his muscles, a lifetime of suppressed force demanding release. He looked at the master, at his pale, soft hands, at the fine linen of his shirt, at the arrogant confidence in his eyes, and he felt nothing but a profound and chilling detachment. He was no longer looking at a man, but at an object, an obstacle that stood between him and the first breath of a free life. The master seemed to sense this shift. The quiet, unnerving stillness of the man before him was not the cowering fear he expected. He saw no plea for mercy in Jeremiah's eyes, no sign of submission. He saw only a flat, calm emptiness that was more unsettling than any outburst of anger. The master's smile faded. His voice lost its mock-gentle tone, replaced by a sharp, irritated edge. He told Jeremiah that he would be made to kneel. He gestured with the whip toward the hard-packed dirt at Jeremiah's feet. It was the final, critical moment, the point of no return. Kneeling was the ultimate posture of submission, an acknowledgement of another's total dominance. For Jeremiah, in that instant, it was an impossible act. To bend his knee now would be to break what was left of his own soul. He did not move. He did not even blink. He simply held his ground, his silence a more powerful act of defiance than any word he could have spoken. The master's face contorted with rage. The game was over. The pretense of a lesson was abandoned, replaced by the raw, naked desire to inflict pain. He took a single, aggressive step forward, raising the whip. He told Jeremiah that he would be taught his place, if not on his knees, then in his own blood. The whip began its upward arc, the leather hissing as it cut through the thick, humid air. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. Jeremiah saw the movement not as a blur, but as a sequence of distinct frozen images. He saw the flex of the master's wrist, the glint of the lantern light on his polished boots, the way his lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl. And in that suspended moment, the dam of a lifetime of restraint shattered into 1,000 pieces. He moved. It was not a wild, clumsy lunge, but an explosion of focused, economical motion. He covered the few feet between them in a single, fluid stride, his body moving with a speed and grace that the master could never have anticipated. He was inside the arc of the whip before it could even begin its descent. His left hand, large and powerful, shot out and clamped down on the master's right shoulder, the fingers digging deep into the softer tissue, anchoring him in place. The master's eyes widened in a brief, silent flash of pure, uncomprehending shock. The whip, its purpose forgotten, fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers and landed in the dirt with a soft thud. Jeremiah's right hand came up, not as a fist, but with the fingers slightly curved. It was the hand that had lifted 100-pound cotton bales, the hand that had swung an axe for 12 hours a day, the hand that knew the precise application of force needed to break a stubborn root or split a piece of hardwood. He did not aim for the master's face. His target was the jaw and the side of the head. His hand cupped the man's skull with a terrifying intimacy. For a fraction of a second, the master struggled, a pathetic, frantic twitching against a force he could not hope to match. He opened his mouth, perhaps to scream, perhaps to issue one last useless command, but no sound came out. Jeremiah's grip was absolute. Then, with a sudden, violent, and decisive motion, he twisted. It was a wrenching, rotational movement, a perfect and horrific transfer of energy from his legs, through his core, and into his arms. There was a sound that was utterly alien to the natural chorus of the night. It was not loud, but it was sharp, obscene, and unforgettable. It was a dense, wet, cracking noise, like a thick, green branch being snapped over a knee. It was the sound of bone giving way, of sinew and cartilage tearing, of a life being extinguished in a single, brutal instant. The sound cut through the chirping of the crickets and seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a resonant, ghastly echo. The immediate aftermath was a silence that was more profound and more absolute than any Jeremiah had ever known. It was as if that one horrific sound had swallowed all other noises in the world. The master's body went limp, a sudden and complete absence of tension. His eyes, still wide with the shock of his last moment, were now vacant, staring at nothing. Jeremiah released his grip. The body crumpled to the ground in a heap, not like a man falling, but like a sack of grain being dropped. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. The head was bent at an impossible, grotesque angle, a clear and undeniable testament to the mortal damage that had been done. The lantern on the barrel flickered, its light dancing over the still form, creating shifting shadows that seemed to mock the finality of death. Jeremiah stood over the body, his chest heaving, his breath coming in deep, ragged gasps. The immense, coiled energy that had propelled him into motion was gone, leaving in its wake a trembling, buzzing emptiness. He looked down at his own hands. They seemed to belong to someone else. They were tingling, alive with the phantom sensation of the force they had just unleashed. He saw the body of the man who had owned him, who had been the architect of his every misery, the absolute and unquestioned God of his world, and he felt a dizzying wave of disbelief. The air rushed back into his lungs, and with it came the terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly alien sensation of freedom. It was not a feeling of triumph or joy. It was a raw, naked, and terrifying state of being. He was free from the master, but he was now standing in a small circle of lantern light, a murderer, in a world that would show him no mercy. The question of what freedom meant when it was purchased with such a coin was answered in that moment. It meant being utterly and completely alone, with the stillness of a dead man at your feet and the weight of a hostile world about to descend upon you. The silence of the night was broken by the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart. The act was done, the snap had been heard, and now the hunt would begin. He took one last look at the fallen man, then turned and vanished into the impenetrable darkness that lay beyond the lantern's glow. The darkness that swallowed Jeremiah was absolute, a thick, palpable blackness that seemed to have a texture and a weight. He plunged into it not with a plan, but with the pure, animal instinct of a creature fleeing a predator. The carefully manicured grounds of the plantation gave way almost immediately to the untamed wilderness that bordered it, a chaotic tangle of undergrowth and ancient trees. His first moments of freedom were a frantic, breathless scramble through thorny vines that tore at his skin and clothes, and over fallen logs slick with damp moss. He did not run in a straight line. He weaved and dodged, using the very obstacles of the forest as a means to break any clear trail. The sounds of the night, which had moments before seemed a rising alarm, were now his allies, a cloak of noise that masked the sound of his own ragged breathing and the snapping of twigs under his feet. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, a powerful chemical tide that sharpened his senses and deadened the burgeoning pain from a dozen small cuts and scrapes. His mind was a maelstrom of stark, terrifying images: the master's vacant eyes, the impossible angle of his head, the soft thud of the body hitting the dirt. But these images did not paralyze him. They propelled him forward, each flashback a fresh spur driving him deeper into the sanctuary of the woods. He knew, with the unerring certainty of a man who had lived his entire life on this land, that his only hope lay in the swamp. The great morass that bordered the plantation to the west was a place the white men feared and avoided. It was a primeval world of cypress knees, stagnant water, and sucking mud, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. It was home to cottonmouths and alligators, to swarms of biting insects that could drive a man mad. But for Jeremiah, it was the lesser of two evils. The dangers of the swamp were natural, honest. They were not born of malice or cruelty. He moved towards it with a grim purpose, his internal compass guiding him through the darkness. His knowledge of the terrain, once a resource to be exploited by his enslaver, was now his single most valuable possession. He knew the high ground, the hidden game trails, the places where the creek ran shallow enough to cross without leaving a scent for dogs to follow. This intimate geography of his bondage was now the map of his escape. As he reached the edge of the swamp, the solid ground beneath his feet gave way to a soft, yielding muck. The air grew even heavier, thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. He waded into the black, knee-deep water without hesitation, the cold shock of it a baptism into his new, precarious existence. He was a ghost, slipping away from the world of men into a realm of shadow and water. Back at the plantation, the silence that followed Jeremiah's departure was eventually, and inevitably, broken. It was not the master's wife who found him, nor one of the house servants who moved with practiced invisibility through the great house. It was the overseer, a man named Phineas, who made the discovery. He had been in his small cottage, methodically cleaning his firearms by the light of a kerosene lamp, when a growing unease began to settle upon him. The master had been explicit about his intentions for Jeremiah, and the overseer had expected to be summoned to assist, or, at the very least, to witness the punishment. The prolonged silence was unusual, a deviation from the established script of plantation justice. With a grumble of irritation, he left his cottage and walked toward the main house. He saw the single lantern still burning on the breezeway, its flame guttering in the slight breeze. From a distance, he saw what he initially took to be a pile of discarded sacks near the barrel. It was only as he drew closer that the shape resolved itself into the form of a man. Phineas approached with a sense of wary confusion, which curdled into dawning horror as he entered the pool of light. He saw the master's fine boots first, then the crumpled posture of the body. He saw the face, pale and slack-jawed in the flickering lamplight, and then he saw the head, canted at an angle so grotesquely unnatural that his mind initially refused to process the information. It was a sight that defied the laws of anatomy, a visceral and undeniable declaration of extreme violence. For a long moment, Phineas simply stared, his own breath caught in his throat. The world, which a moment before had been governed by a rigid and unshakable order, had been turned completely upside down. The master was not merely dead, he had been broken like a child's toy. The overseer's reaction was not one of grief. It was a jolt of cold primal fear, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. This was not just the death of a man. It was an act of insurrection, the ultimate transgression, a spark that could ignite the entire powder keg of their society. He turned from the body and let out a roar that tore through the quiet of the night, a raw, bellowing sound of alarm. He ran to the large cast-iron bell that hung from a post near the barns, a bell used to signal the start and end of the workday, or in the event of a fire. He grabbed the thick rope and began to pull with a frantic, desperate energy. The deep, resonant clang of the bell shattered the night, a frantic, hammering peal that was not a call to work, but a summons to war. The sound of the bell traveled for miles across the still, humid air, a message understood instantly by every planter and farmer who heard it. Lights began to appear in the windows of distant farmhouses. Men, startled from their sleep, grabbed rifles and pistols that were always kept close at hand. This was the nightmare they all secretly harbored, the possibility that the brutal system they presided over could one day turn on them with the same violence they used to maintain it. Within the hour, a grim procession of men on horseback began to converge on the plantation. They were a mix of landowners in their nightshirts, rough-looking farmhands, and the professional slave catchers who made their living from the hunting of human beings. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light of hastily lit pine knot torches, were a mask of grim determination and barely concealed panic. The discovery of the body, now laid out on a rough wooden table, only served to fuel their fury. The story of what had happened passed from man to man in hushed, angry whispers. It was the detail of the broken neck that seized their imagination. It was an act of impossible, almost supernatural strength, an act of intimate, hands-on brutality that was far more terrifying than a simple shooting or stabbing. The scene descended into a kind of organized chaos. A large posse was formed, its de facto leader a grizzled, humorless slave catcher named Titus, a man known for his relentless tenacity and his pack of expertly trained tracking dogs. The dogs, a mix of bloodhounds and curs, whined and strained at their leashes, their senses overwhelmed by the scent of fear and death that hung in the air. The men checked their weapons, filled their flasks with whiskey, and spoke in low, clipped tones. They were not just embarking on a manhunt, they were participating in a ritual, a violent reaffirmation of their power. They were going to restore the natural order of their world, and they were going to do it with overwhelming and terrifying force. The initial search around the plantation buildings yielded a clear trail leading toward the swamp. Titus brought one of the hounds to the spot where Jeremiah had vanished into the darkness. The dog lowered its head, sniffed the ground with a deep, guttural intake of breath, and then let out a long, mournful bay, a sound that signaled the hunt had truly begun. The procession of men, with their bobbing lanterns and torches, moved off into the woods, a river of fire and iron flowing into the darkness, the excited yelping of the dogs echoing ahead of them. News of the killing traveled even faster than the posse. A rider was dispatched to Vicksburg almost immediately, his horse kicking up mud as it galloped down the dark road to the city. The story arrived before dawn, and it spread through the city like a fever. It moved from the waterfront taverns to the merchants' drawing rooms, from the stables to the front porches of the grand houses on the bluffs. And with each telling, the story of Jeremiah Cobb grew. He was no longer just a man. He was a creature of immense and terrifying power, a monster who could snap a man's neck as easily as one might snap a dry twig. The white citizens of Vicksburg reacted with a wave of collective fear that bordered on hysteria. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and extra patrols of the city watch were organized. Every tall, strong black man was suddenly viewed with suspicion and terror. The incident confirmed their deepest, most unspoken anxieties about the people they held in bondage. It was proof that beneath the surface of submission and deference lay a well of potential violence that could erupt at any moment. Among the enslaved community of Vicksburg, the news spread through a different, more subtle network. It was passed in a shared glance between two stevedores on the docks, in a coded phrase whispered by a cook in the market, in a story told to children in the dead of night. There was no celebration, no open talk of rebellion. The fear of reprisal was too great, but there was a current of something else, a deeply unsettling mix of awe, terror, and a grim, unspoken satisfaction. Jeremiah Cobb had done the unthinkable. He had met the violence of the master with a greater, more absolute violence of his own. He had become a figure of folklore overnight, a dark and dangerous legend. He was a cautionary tale, to be sure, a reminder of the terrible price of defiance, but he was also something more. He was a symbol of a boundary being crossed, a testament to the fact that even the most oppressed man had a breaking point. While the white community saw him as a monster to be destroyed, the enslaved whispered his name with a kind of terrified reverence. He was the neck snapper, a name that carried the weight of both a horrific crime and a desperate, bloody act of liberation. The system built to crush a man like Jeremiah was now fully mobilized against him, a vast and relentless machine of pursuit. But in fleeing, he had already outrun their ability to control his story. He had become a myth, and myths are notoriously difficult to kill. The chase was on, a desperate contest between a lone man in the wilderness and a society that could not, and would not, allow him to remain free. The swamp had swallowed him, but the dogs were baying at its edge, and the net was already beginning to tighten. The swamp was a labyrinth of suffocating humidity and perpetual twilight. Even during the brightest part of the day, the dense canopy of cypress and tupelo trees allowed only a dappled, spectral light to reach the forest floor. For 3 days, Jeremiah moved through this purgatorial landscape, a fugitive specter in a world that seemed actively hostile to human life. He became a creature of the swamp, his movements dictated by the terrain and the constant, pressing need for concealment. He learned to walk with a slow, deliberate pace, placing his feet carefully on the submerged roots and hummocks of grass to avoid the deep, treacherous pockets of quicksand-like mud. He coated his skin with a layer of this same dark mud, a desperate, primal camouflage that helped him blend into the shadows and offered some meager protection against the swarms of mosquitoes that rose in whining clouds from the stagnant water. His senses, already sharpened by a life of paying close attention to his surroundings, became preternaturally acute. He could distinguish the rustle of a snake in the undergrowth from the sound of a falling leaf. He learned to read the subtle currents in the black water, to identify the telltale shape of an alligator lurking just beneath the surface. Hunger became a constant, gnawing ache in his belly. He foraged for what he could, his knowledge of the wild providing a slim margin against starvation. He found cattail roots, which he ate raw, and the small tart berries of a wild vine he recognized from his youth. Thirst was a more immediate and dangerous problem. The stagnant water of the swamp was a breeding ground for disease, and he knew that to drink from it was to invite a slow, agonizing death. He followed the direction of the songbirds, knowing they would eventually lead him to the slightly fresher water of a slow-moving creek, where he drank cautiously, his eyes constantly scanning the dense foliage around him. Sleep offered no real rest. He would find a relatively dry spot at the base of a large cypress, its gnarled roots forming a kind of natural fortress, and he would doze in short, fitful bursts, never fully surrendering to unconsciousness. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a night bird, would jolt him back to a state of high alert. He was haunted by the constant, terrifying thought of the dogs. He could not yet hear them, but he could imagine them, their noses to the ground, relentlessly unraveling the complex tapestry of his trail. The baying of the hounds was the soundtrack to his nightmares, a sound he knew would eventually become his reality. The hunt was as relentless as Jeremiah's flight was desperate. Titus, the slave catcher, was a master of his grim trade. He understood the swamp, not with the intimate, immersive knowledge of Jeremiah, but with the cold, analytical mind of a predator. He knew how a fugitive would think, how he would use the terrain to his advantage. He did not plunge his posse into the morass in a single, chaotic charge. He was methodical. He established a base camp at the edge of the swamp and sent out smaller, exploratory patrols to probe its depths and search for any sign of a trail. The dogs were his most valuable weapon. On the first day, they lost the scent where Jeremiah had entered the water, and the posse's initial confidence gave way to a sullen frustration. The men, unaccustomed to the oppressive environment of the swamp, cursed the heat, the insects, and the clinging mud. Some of them wanted to give up, to declare the swamp had swallowed the fugitive for good. But Titus was implacable. He knew that a man on foot, no matter how clever, would eventually have to touch dry land. On the third day, his patience was rewarded. A young, inexperienced dog, ranging far from the main pack, let out a single, excited yelp from a small island of solid ground deep within the swamp. Titus and his men converged on the spot. There, in a patch of soft earth, they found it. A single, clear footprint, its size and shape unmistakable. Jeremiah, in a moment of exhaustion, had made a mistake. He had spent too long on a piece of ground that could hold his sign. For Titus, it was all he needed. He brought the lead dog, a massive bloodhound with a mournful face and an unerring nose, to the spot. The dog sniffed the print once, twice, and then lifted its head to the sky and let out a deep, resonant bay that echoed through the cypress trees, a sound that was both a lament and a declaration of victory. The hunt was on again, but this time it was different. It was no longer a speculative search. It was a direct, focused pursuit. The dogs, now unified on a fresh, strong scent, surged forward, their voices joining in a terrifying chorus. Jeremiah heard it. He was miles away, resting for a moment, when the faint, distant sound reached his ears. It was the sound he had been dreading, the sound that had populated his nightmares. It sent a jolt of pure, ice-cold fear through him. He knew what it meant. They had found him. His time of relative safety was over. The cat and mouse game had entered its final, deadly phase. He began to move again, this time with a frantic, desperate energy that he could not sustain for long. He plunged through the water, heedless of the noise he was making, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and the baying of the hounds. But the dogs were faster. Their baying grew steadily louder, closer, more distinct. It was no longer a distant echo. It was a clear and present threat. He could hear the individual voices of the dogs now, the deep baritone of the lead hound and the higher, more frenzied yelps of the others. He could hear the crashing of the men as they followed, their shouted commands to each other cutting through the natural sounds of the swamp. He was finally run to ground in a small clearing, a patch of semi-solid earth dominated by a massive, fallen cypress tree. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, and he knew he could run no further. He scrambled onto the immense trunk of the fallen tree, his back against a thick, upturned root ball, and he waited. The dogs burst into the clearing first, a frantic, snarling pack of fur and teeth. They surrounded the log, leaping and snapping, their eyes wild with the thrill of the chase. Then the men arrived, their clothes torn and smeared with mud, their faces flushed with exertion and grim triumph. Titus was at the front, a long rifle held loosely in his hands. He looked at Jeremiah, perched on the log like a cornered animal, and he allowed himself a small, cruel smile. He made a gesture with his hand, and the other men slowly spread out, forming a loose semicircle, their own weapons raised and ready. There was no escape. The capture itself was a brutal, perfunctory affair. Jeremiah did not fight. He had no weapon, and he knew that any resistance would be met with an immediate and lethal volley of gunfire. He simply stared back at the men, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and defiance. Titus gave an order, and two of his men, brandishing thick ropes, cautiously approached the log. They bound his hands behind his back, pulling the ropes so tight they cut into his flesh. They looped another rope around his neck, the end of which Titus held himself. They dragged him from the log and forced him to his knees in the mud. For a moment, it seemed as if the justice of the posse would be administered right there, in that dark, forgotten corner of the swamp. The men were in a fever pitch of rage and excitement, their voices a low, angry growl. They spoke of stringing him up from the nearest cypress tree, of making an example of him that the gulls themselves would witness. But Titus, for all his brutality, was also a businessman. There was a substantial bounty on Jeremiah's head, a reward that could only be claimed if the fugitive was delivered, alive, to the authorities in Vicksburg. He held up a hand and quieted the mob. He told them that the pleasure of the kill was nothing compared to the pleasure of the coin, and that Vicksburg deserved a public spectacle. His words, appealing to their greed, had the desired effect. The men, grumbling, lowered their weapons. The decision was made. Jeremiah would be taken back to the city to face a more formal, but no less certain, form of vengeance. The journey back was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Jeremiah was forced to walk, the rope around his neck keeping him tethered to Titus's horse. He stumbled through the swamp, the ropes on his wrists, chafing his skin raw, the jeers and prods of the men a constant, humiliating reminder of his defeat. When they finally emerged from the swamp, news of his capture had already preceded them. A small, grim crowd had gathered at the edge of the plantation to watch the procession. In Vicksburg, The atmosphere was one of grim, expectant celebration. The capture of the neck snapper was seen as a restoration of order, a triumph of civilization over savagery. There was no question of a fair trial. The legal system in 1852 Mississippi, particularly for an enslaved man accused of killing his master, was not a mechanism for determining guilt or innocence. It was an instrument for reinforcing the social order through the application of terror. The trial, such as it was a brief, theatrical formality held in the county courthouse. Jeremiah was not allowed to speak in his own defense. He was not provided with legal counsel. He stood before a judge and a jury composed entirely of white landowners, men who were the peers of the man he had killed. The evidence was presented, the verdict was a foregone conclusion, and the sentence was delivered with a solemnity that belied its brutal nature. Jeremiah Cobb was found guilty of murder and insurrection, and he was sentenced to be hanged in the public square. The day of the execution was declared a public event. A large crowd gathered in the square, a strange mix of somber-faced planters, curious townspeople, and groups of enslaved men and women who had been forced to attend by their masters. The message was clear. This was the fate of any who dared to rebel. A crude gallows had been erected, its stark, angular frame a brutalist sculpture against the pale morning sky. Jeremiah was led from the jail, his hands bound, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the crowd. He did not seem to hear their jeers or their muttered curses. He walked with a steady, deliberate gait, his gaze fixed on the gallows. He was made to stand on the platform. The noose was placed around his neck, and a local preacher offered a brief, hollow prayer for his soul. When asked if he had any last words, Jeremiah remained silent. He had been a man of few words in life, and he would be a man of few words in death. He simply lifted his head and looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the enslaved people who had been brought there to witness his end. He looked at them for a long moment, and in his eyes there was not fear, nor hatred, nor remorse. There was only a vast, deep, and unbreakable silence. And then the trapdoor sprung, and Jeremiah Cobb was gone. The punishment was complete. It had been swift, brutal, and public, a terrifying spectacle designed to burn itself into the memory of all who saw it. It was not justice. It was vengeance, a desperate and violent attempt to erase an act of defiance that had shaken the foundations of their world. But in killing the man, they had only succeeded in solidifying the legend. The body of Jeremiah Cobb was left to hang in the public square for the remainder of the day, a grotesque pendulum marking the slow passage of a sun-drenched afternoon. It was a calculated act of state-sponsored terror, a piece of political theater designed to convey a message of absolute and unassailable authority. The crowd, having witnessed the final, convulsive moments of the execution, dispersed slowly, not with the boisterous energy of a satisfied mob, but with a kind of weary, sullen gravity. The planters and merchants walked away in tight, sober clusters, their conversations low and self-congratulatory, reaffirming to one another the grim necessity of what had been done. The enslaved men and women who had been forced to attend were herded back to their respective places of bondage, their faces a carefully composed mask of blank indifference, their eyes fixed on the dusty ground. They carried the image of the hanging man back with them, a silent, heavy burden that would settle deep into the collective memory of their community. As evening approached and the shadows grew long in the square, the body was finally cut down, not with any sense of dignity or ceremony, but with the rough efficiency of a butcher handling a side of meat. It was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field on the edge of the city, a final, deliberate act of erasure, an attempt to consign not just the man, but the very memory of his existence to the indifferent earth. But a story, once told, is not so easily buried. In the aftermath of the execution, two distinct and irreconcilable legends of Jeremiah Cobb began to grow, nourished by the fertile soil of fear and memory. In the world of white Vicksburg, the story of the neck snapper was cultivated as a monstrous cautionary tale, a piece of dark folklore designed to reinforce the foundations of the slaveholding society. It became a sermon delivered from the pulpit, a grim warning against the sin of pride and the dangers of allowing the so-called lesser races to forget their divinely ordained station. Preachers spoke of Jeremiah not as a man, but as a vessel for a demonic rage, an example of the inherent savagery that lurked just beneath the surface of a placid obedience. They described his act not as a response to cruelty, but as a Cain-like betrayal, a rejection of the paternalistic care of a master who, in this sanitized telling of the story, was recast as a benevolent, if firm, patriarch. The narrative was stripped of all context, all nuance, all humanity. Jeremiah's years of silent endurance, the escalating abuse he had suffered, the specific incident with the young boy in the field, all of these vital details were meticulously excised from the official account. This sanitized version of the legend became a tool of domestic terror, a story told by parents to frighten misbehaving children into obedience. He was transformed into a nocturnal predator, a boogeyman who lurked in the shadows, his unnaturally powerful hands ready to snap the neck of anyone who defied authority. The specific, visceral detail of the killing was the cornerstone of this myth. It was presented as evidence of his subhuman nature. A civilized man, the story implied, might use a knife or a gun, but only a creature of pure, animalistic impulse would kill with his bare hands in such a brutal and intimate fashion. The act was framed as a violation of the natural order, an eruption of primal chaos into a world of supposed Christian order. This version of Jeremiah Cobb served a vital purpose for the enslaver class. It allowed them to displace their own deep-seated fears onto a single, monstrous figure. He became the repository for all their anxieties about slave rebellion, a convenient scapegoat whose story could be used to justify the very brutality that had created him in the first place. The legend, in this form, was a closed loop of self-serving logic. The enslaved were inherently violent, as proven by the story of Jeremiah Cobb, and therefore they must be controlled with constant, unyielding violence, lest another Jeremiah Cobb arise. It was a ghost story with a clear political function, a myth designed to haunt the enslaved into submission and reassure the enslavers of their own righteousness. But beyond the hearing of the masters, in the close, humid confines of the slave cabins, a different legend was taking root. It was a story told in whispers, a secret history passed from one generation to the next, a piece of folklore that was as potent and as vital as the official narrative was sterile and false. In this telling, Jeremiah Cobb was not a monster. He was a man who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, a man who had absorbed a lifetime of pain and humiliation until he could absorb no more. The story here was rich with the details that the white legend had erased. They spoke of the master's cruelty, not as a generalization, but in a litany of specific, remembered atrocities. They spoke of Jeremiah's profound silence, not as a sign of brutish simplicity, but as a mark of his immense self-control, his deep and watchful intelligence. They remembered his uncanny ability to read the sky, seeing it as a sign of his connection to a deeper, more natural world, a world with its own immutable laws that were far older than the transient laws of men. In this secret telling, the confrontation at the breezeway was not an act of savage impulse, but a moment of terrible, righteous judgment. The snap of the master's neck was not a sound of chaos, but a sound of chains breaking. It was a sound of accounts being settled, of a debt being paid in a currency the master had never imagined would be used against him. Jeremiah was transformed into a figure of dark and terrifying power, a kind of avenging angel forged in the fires of the cotton fields. He was not a hero in the simple sense of the word. His story was too grim, its ending too tragic, for any kind of triumphalism. Instead, he became a figure of awe, a man who had dared to do the unthinkable, who had looked absolute power in the face and met it with a more absolute and final force. He was a symbol of the breaking point, a stark and terrifying reminder that the human spirit, while it could be bent, could not always be prevented from snapping back with lethal force. This legend was also a cautionary tale, but its lesson was entirely different. It was a warning about the catastrophic cost of rebellion, a reminder of the swift and merciless vengeance of the system. But it was also a story that contained a kernel of fierce, defiant pride. He had been captured, yes, he had been killed, but he had not been broken. He had died on his feet, in his own silence, having claimed for himself, if only for a few desperate days, a freedom that his captors had never intended for him to know. His name became a kind of code, a way of speaking about resistance without using the forbidden words. A man might say that the weather looked like a storm was coming, and another might reply that he remembered a man who could read the sky, and a whole, unspoken history of defiance and retribution would pass between them in that simple, coded exchange. As the years turned into decades, as the Civil War raged, and the institution of slavery was finally violently dismantled, the two legends of Jeremiah Cobb began to fade and merge, losing their sharp political edges and becoming a more general piece of regional folklore. The specific historical figure of Jeremiah, the man who had lived and breathed and suffered, was slowly subsumed by the myth. He became a ghost, a restless spirit, said to haunt the swamps and the fallow cotton fields of Warren County. Stories were told of a large, silent figure seen walking the edge of the woods at dusk, a phantom of the old times, a lingering presence from a past that refused to be fully buried. The plantation house itself, which fell into ruin after the war, became a place of local superstition, a place that children dared each other to approach, a place where it was said you could sometimes hear a sharp, cracking sound on a still, quiet night, a sound that would make the hair on your arms stand on end. The legend had become unmoored from its origins, a piece of the rich and haunted tapestry of the American South. So what does this legacy make him? Was Jeremiah Cobb a vicious criminal, a heroic rebel, or something far more complex and unsettling that resides in the gray space between those two poles? The historical record, such as it is, can only answer that he was a murderer. He took a human life with his own hands, an act of brutal, undeniable violence. But to leave the assessment there is to accept the sanitized logic of his executioners. His crime cannot be extricated from the context of the much larger, legally sanctioned crime of chattel slavery, a system that functioned through the constant application of violence and the complete negation of his humanity. Jeremiah's act was a spasm of violence, born from a world that had offered him nothing but violence his entire life. It was not the first blow in a war of liberation. It was the last, desperate act of a man who had decided that a death of his own choosing was preferable to a life of unending submission. He was not a hero, for his act saved no one, not even himself. He was not a monster, for his rage was a profoundly human response to an inhuman condition. He was, perhaps, simply a consequence. He was the logical, inevitable result of a system so cruel and so absolute that it could, on occasion, produce a man who had nothing left to lose. His story is not a comforting parable of good versus evil. It is a haunting testament to the brutalizing effects of absolute power and the terrifying, unpredictable nature of the human breaking point. His legend in all its forms, serves as a stark reminder of the ghosts that still walk the landscapes of American history, the forgotten lives, and the violent acts that lie just beneath the surface of the present day, waiting for their stories to be told. The record on Jeremiah Cobb is complete, and your presence through its final page honors a history that was almost lost to silence. If these are the corridors of the past you feel compelled to walk, for more, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you are among us when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments what this story left behind for you.